Take your seats. TBD. Great. Right. Okay. A hush just descended. It seems like we're ready. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Cosette Burns Alonso. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here in Penn Libraries in the Center for Research Data and Digital Scholarship and at Penn Press. I'm really delighted to introduce the speakers for our final panel of this afternoon. We'll begin with Dr. Dominic Oyaru. Is associate professor in art history at the University of Dusseldorf. His research focuses on the anthropology and the culture of images and borrows perspectives from visual culture, cultural anthropology, philosophy, theology, French history of mentalities, as well as the history of the sciences in the 12th through 17th centuries. He is author of numerous publications, including the forthcoming monograph, Botany Before Brunfels, epistemically plant pictures and manuscripts of the 14th to 16th centuries. His talk today is titled Plant Nature, Printing in the 15th and 16th Centuries as Translating Science.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I would like first to join the thankings to Lynn and everybody else who organized this great meeting and conference. I enjoyed very much. Well, my paper is, as Lynn proposed it, a work in progress. It's a topic that is still a work in progress on plant illustrations, which stems of the named book about plant imagery in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. And my reflection interest is the translation of sensory experiences in pictures, plant pictures mainly, in the late Middle Ages, and in images as carrier of plant informations. In the early and high Middle Ages, plant illustrations in the Occident were, for all we know, rather schematic and ornamental, a quality difficult to reconcile with likeness and with the transmission of knowledge about plants and their morphology. Basically, since Roman antiquity, the Occident has reacted to lifelike plant images for study with little sympathy, even aversion. Pliny the Elder, in his Naturalis Historia, written shortly before AD 79, already pointed out the fundamental difficulty of executing plant pictures. First, exceptionally good painters were needed to render the plants properly, he says. Second, copists had to reproduce the images accurately when replicating a manuscript. Yet this proved to be extremely difficult because copists did not understand plant morphology well and did not have a clear idea of what morphological details to pay attention to when painting. And I was somehow reminded by Ahmed's talk. The plant is a book and you need the teacher to teach the painter how to read this book, how to depict it. So it was difficult to choose representative medieval plant illustration. I went for this one, but you have to imagine a lot of text on the other side of this illustration. So the picture is integrated in a very long text discussing mainly curative effects and little morphological descriptions. In the Occident, images of plants as carriers of morphological information developed approximately from the 11th century onwards, with images based on observation of nature, experiencing a major boom from the 14th century onwards. In particular, the so-called Belluno herbal, named after the northern Italian area, which can be dated to about 1373 on the basis of a watermark on a fragment of the Schönberg Institute shows how intensely analytical studies of nature were conducted at that time, and that knowledge resulting from observational studies were translated into plant images. 9 manuscript fragments with extremely faithful copies of the Belluno Herbal, as well as 2 almost complete copies of the Herbal, have survived. My codicological analysis revealed that they all belong to 4 copies of the original manuscript executed around 1373. This results from the fact that comparison of the fragments with each other shows inaccuracies. Some fragments bear additional illustrations, that the captions are not in their original place in relation to the illustrations, that scribal errors could be detected, etc. All copies and the original were executed on paper. Not only did scribes copy the text from the original, but painters also did their best to reproduce the images with great accuracy. Obviously, there was a strong need to replicate the manuscript, since 3 copies of the manuscript can be traced for a period of about 3 decades after the execution of the original. Furthermore, we may assume that other paper copies of the manuscript have been lost. A pair of exact copies of the Belluno Herbal not only shows the great interest for illustrated botanical working manuscripts in the Belluno region. So I call this working manuscript that you use for your research, for your work, for your profession. It also indicates the existence of an organized production of these paper manuscripts there. The simple usage of watercolors, which dry quickly and can be used much like a drawing pencil, and the page layout, which gave great freedom to the scribes and painters without constraining them by underlinings for the texts and by image fields, met the challenges of a high and fairly rapid production. I would now like to turn to nature printing by suggesting it was another response to the challenges of producing rapid and accurate plant images that I have just described. And I will show you 6 slides of the earliest nature printings that have preserved it. From the same area as the Belluno Herbal come the oldest Occidental nature prints made around 1427 and now in the University Library of Salzburg in Austria. Plant parts were smeared with a mixture of linseed oil and soot, perhaps also a green pigment, and then pressed onto the paper, leaving a clear imprint on it, also called ectype. 83 ectypes are distributed in an extremely clean and clear imprint on it. A clean and orderly manner on 12 bound sheets of paper. The impressions are taken from contemporary plants used as drugs, next to which were added plant names in Latin, an Italian dialect from the Belluno area, and a German dialect. Shortly after its execution, the booklet was obviously added to a compilation of manuscript texts, which the Dr. Konrad of Butzbach had autographed in 1425 in Hessen-Laubach in Germany. William Ivans argued in 1953 that it was the technology of printing that produced, quote, an exactly repeatable pictorial statement, unquote, and thus enabled scientific exchange. According to Ivans, only the exactly repeatable image made scientific exchange possible because it established a standard of norming that enables scholars to discuss the same thing. Scholars were now able to talk about one and the same image and thus arrive at new research results together. A little later, Ernst Gombrich was to sharply criticize Ivans' focus on the achievements of letterpress printing, pointing to facsimile-like images of book illumination, such as those of the Belluno Herbal, by the way, which were made long before letterpress printing. I would like to broaden Gombrich's perspective and ask, to what extent were nature prints precursors to what William Ivins called exactly repeatable pictorial statements? Could nature printing enable the standardization of professional exchange? Was nature printing the translation in images of empirical knowledge practices with plants? All printed plants in Salzburg exhibit a flawless condition without blemishes. Their contours are clear and uninterrupted, and thus manifest the greatest care in their selection and arrangement. This conjecture is reinforced by the fact that many of them are placed actually on the paper. Some plants are grouped according to morphological criteria. For example, 3 similar longish plants were printed together on a page, and on another page, not shown here, are 3 types of geranium. We don't possess any detailed contemporary information about the workmanship of the technique. However, according to the most comprehensive explanation of the technique of nature printing known to me, albeit much more recent, published in 1784, by the German Ernst Martius in his book, Newest Instruction, How to Print Plants from Life, nature printing was a delicate process that was extremely complex in most cases and depended on the quality of the plants to be printed, especially the quality of the plant surfaces. Although the Belluno printer illustrator was confronted with plants requiring considerable proficiency, he achieved high quality images that accurately visualize contours and inner structures. The shape of the prints and the booklet itself suggest that they were the outcome of an organized process of manufacture. For instance, the booklet pages carry a barely visible frame defining the space for the illustrations. Not really to be seen on this on these slides. You can a bit of this lining. So the barely visible defining lining defining the space for the illustrations delineated prior to the nature prints. For this, first a blind ruling has been applied with a sharp metal point stylus scratching the paper. In a second step, the lead point ruling has been added on top of this. The nature prints respect the lead point ruling on all 4 margins by aligning themselves centrally within the framed space or by extending exactly to its markings. With one accidental exception, all spacing between the prints is similar. The prints occupy their own defined space on the paper sheet as if they were the images of a botanical atlas. Finally, lead white was employed on several pages to cover ink stains, a practice common in manuscript workshops. This suggests that the utmost accuracy of the impressions execution meet the requirements of a professional commissioned work rather than that made by a non-professional individual. This seems to be confirmed by 2 additional aspects. First, the iconography is outstanding in the nature prints. The growth from sweet spurge, for example, is difficult to imitate in print. In the 2nd year of growing, the plant forms a wreath of 4 or 5 leaves at the end of the stem, from which grow 4 or 5 radial stalks wearing leaves at their end. The Belluno herbal shows sweet spurge in its 2nd year of growth and adds a somewhat clumsy illustration, bird's eye view of the plant leafage. Of the nature print, in contrast, managed to arrange the plant leaves in such a way that they give a very good 3-dimensional impression of the natural plant. So please don't take into account the writing here. It has been added much later. And I guess you can see quite well comparing with the photo, this 3-dimensional structure that he managed to bring into paper, on the paper. Belluno print even conveys the plant appearance much better than the 3 centuries later nature print by Johannes Hieronymus Kniephoff. From 1733 to 1764, Kniephoff marketed his individually executed nature prints in books laid out and looking like botanical atlases, and is considered one of the greatest specialists in the field of nature printing of all time. Therefore, in my opinion, the quality of making the Salzburg nature prints points to a trained eye of an illustrator with extensive experience in this imaging process. The second aspect, eventually confirming the Salzburg prints being the product of a specialized, organized workmanship, is the iconographic proximity of some nature prints to painted images found in the Belluno herbal. We have already seen the closeness between the sweet spurge painting and the corresponding print. The egg type of the Martagon lily, to name another instance, also is linked with the Belluno herbal. It does not show a single foliage leaf, but an entire whorl with 6 leaves, thus creating an illustration in top-down view. In doing so, the print adopted an iconographic innovation that for the first time appeared in the Belluno herbal. At least I do not know of any earlier depiction of Martagon lily showing the whole in plan view. So what you see here is repeated here, I want to show. Thus, the pictorial proximity between the images of the Belluno herbal and the prints in Salzburg suggests that the maker of the prints had knowledge of images in painted herbals and based his prints on them. If what I have just suggested holds good, then one or more individuals in Belluno have executed egg types in the first quarter of the 15th century in a truly competent manner, using a workshop-like structure. The existence of these workshops would also mean a great demand for nature prints and analytical pictorial materials such as that in the Belluno herbal. Regardless of the existence of organized production, the egg types indicate that the translation of personal visual experience into pictorial representations had become important at the beginning of the 15th century. When exactly the awareness of the role of personal experience for plant studies began in the Occident is difficult to define. If one takes the naturalistic depiction of plants as a point of reference for this, then isolated pinpoint images seem to indicate drawing from the natural plant as early as the 11th century. In the 14th century, these indications increased as time progressed. So we have probably, we have much more lifelike pictures in the 14th century. The advent of nature printing certainly represented one peak within these changes. It demonstrates that visual perception had become decisive for the identification and study of plants. The prints in the Salzburg manuscript do not bear any descriptive information, neither on the appearance of the plants nor on their healing properties. Only the name of the plant and synonyms of the names were noted next to the prints. The user of the egg types was therefore dependent on the morphological features fixed within the imprints to recognize or study the corresponding plants. The names and synonyms carry linguistic peculiarities. German influences can be discerned in the phonetic transcriptions of Italian plant names. There are typical expressions of the Belluno dialect. There are German plant names. And finally, some Italian words have been spelled the German way, for instance, using the letter W, which is absent in Latin and Italian, of course. Therefore, it may be assumed that the first user was a German who visited northern Italy and took notes on the vernacular plant names and synonyms. He was lettered and active in the paramedical field, since he knew Latin and employed a specific medical vocabulary. Twice he noted, besides the synonyms, the Latin words for dropsy and gout. Thus, the German probably acquired the egg types in Belluno and later brought them to Hesse. Perhaps they were initially useful to him during his medical studies at the University of Padua and Pavia. Regarding the cognitive quality of egg types, several aspects prove useful for plant studies. First, They have distinct advantages over pictorial representations. They accurately reproduce the outlines of relief-like forms, for instance, the venous system or hairnets of the foliage leaves, and they render accurately the proportions and lifelike size. Second, thanks to the mechanical impression process, archetypes minimized artists' errors and seem to be a solution to Pliny's objection, at least with respect to the morphological features printed. Moreover, the illustrators making archetypes raised their personal observation, autopsia, to the actual image program. The image stood for the shown plant parts and could replace their examination within a certain but not non-negligible degree. With the exception of the use of dried plants, nature printing was the only way to capture the plant's authenticity in images. Yet the use of dried plants for plant studies was only seemingly more convenient and efficient. After all, until a way was found to safely attach them to paper, the dried plants must have been very fragile and thus difficult to handle. What this slide hopefully shows. Even attached on paper, they remained fragile. It is true that shortly before 1404, dried plants, including a dried viola, were depicted in Padua, which is immediately adjacent to the Bellunio region. However, these do not appear to have been fixed to a support, for the earliest known booklets with pasted plants are dated to the 1520s. In contrast, archetypes, as shown by the prints taken to Hesse, were easy to transport and presumably well suited for field studies. A remarkable little handbook seems to confirm this. The Prague physician Christian of Prachatice wrote it in 1432, and it seems to have been very popular since 5 copies of it alone have survived. Christian called it in Latin breviatorium because in it he had concisely recorded his plant knowledge in text form. Quote, if anyone, Christian let his word begin, whenever he wanders over the fields, meadows, and mountains, would like to know the healing powers of herbs in short form, he should carry this breviatorium with him, with which he will find arranged alphabetically the names, complexions, and healing powers of the most important herbs according to Serapion, unquote. If field studies were being conducted in 1432, then images for field studies must have been an overwhelmingly important tool for identifying plants. Christian may have even written his booklet in northern Italy, for as the very manuscript with the viola illustration shows, by then the herbal of the Arab Serapion had become recognized as an important writing in northern Italy. Although Serapion's treatise was translated into Latin as Liber Aggregatus in 1290, the writing seems to have been little received at first. Yet in the last decade of the 14th century, Serapion's statements on herbs were taken up in the so-called Tarquina Sanitatis, herbals of the Visconti dynasty at Pavia in northern Italy. The manuscript with the viola itself was a complete translation into Italian of Serapion's herbal. Getting to the end of my paper, the proposition made by my paper is the following. My focus on the technical process described document a shift in practices of and attitude towards plant studies around 1400. A shift that can be understood as translations of scholar plant studies using few and abstract images and probably practicing no or only little personal observation to studies based on sensory and visual experience. Within this translation process, plant images became autonomous instruments of plant studies and were not anymore simple auxiliary accessories to texts. Nature prints, by reproducing parts of natural plants one-to-one, can, in my view, be understood as an iconic standardization within scholarly exchange. also the images, that is, the individual archetypes, are not identical to each other. They reproduce in an authentic way nature, which in turn now becomes the actual image standard. To put it simply, when Konrad von Butzbach saw the archetypes in Hesse, he had the same impression as the Italian would have seen in Italy. So I think with this, maybe the exchange of archetypes would be a precursor of what Ivins called the exchangeable, exactly repeatable image. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is Dr. Jack Hartnell, is Associate Professor of Art History in the School of Art, Media, and American Studies at the University of East Anglia. His research and teaching focus on the visual culture of late medieval and early Renaissance medicine, cartography, and mathematics, in addition to 20th century painting and contemporary political caricature. I'm sure this is a very generative week for that pursuit. He was the 2019 to 2020 Dibner Fellow in History, in the History of Science and Technology at the Huntington Library in California. He is an author and translator, and his publications include his monograph, Medieval Bodies, Life, Death, and Art in the Middle Ages. His intervention today is titled Translating Visual Phlebotomy, Visual Bloodletting, rather.
I like that, an intervention. Yes, that's exactly what this is. Start my timer. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lynn, so much for having me, and to Lynn and Ellie and to Nick for the invitation. Thanks to Eric, who helped facilitate me getting here from the UK. It's about 10 o'clock in the evening in my brain, so I hope we're still firing. And yes, this is the last paper of the day, but I hope there'll be plenty of stuff for you to feast your eyes on visually if you decide to quietly nod off. That's fine. My ambition today is slightly less grand in some ways than some of the amazing papers we've already heard, in that I want to share with you, by way of a sort of case study in thinking about translation, some ideas generated by a survey, which sounds boring, but I promise you it isn't. It's because it's a survey of some 200 bloodletting figures. Now, these are figures from medieval manuscripts, which purport to direct or showcase or in some way preserve information on phlebotomy. That is the medical, or you could say semi-medical, paramedical practice of letting blood to balance the humors. And I would say of the 200 or so I've seen, those 200 represent, I would say, a fair proportion of those which survived from Europe in the 14th, 15th centuries, a large proportion of them, at least. And I'm thinking here about Western Europe, but we'll come on to that. My approach among this kind of mixed methodological medley of speakers that we have today and tomorrow is very much that of an art historian and a historian of medicine. So this is very much medico-visual material. And it's largely focused on one historical moment, on the 15th century and some 14th century material as well. But I hope that, you know, in spite of that, or maybe because of that critical and chronological specificity, I can still help us continue meaningfully thinking together about what scientific translation might mean in this moment and how it's practiced. And so, just to give you a sense of what's to come, I want to do this really to move through this material in two parts. First, I want to give you some context for bloodletting in these medieval manuscripts and for these images more broadly, where they fit in. So that's the first half of the talk. And then the second half, I suppose I want to pull out some ways in which these images help us talk and think about translation, both in a linguistic and, importantly, in a non-linguistic sense. So first to context, and just so you have something nice to look at, here's a nice Northern Italian manuscript, Hebrew manuscript. It's medical manuscript. The text is on auspicious days, but it's a woman who's having her basilic vein in the kind of crook of her, the opposite side of her elbow, being bled. And in terms of bloodletting context, which I said is where I want to begin, It's worth starting by saying that as a practical craft, also often a non-academic medical craft, undertaken by both literate but also non-literate, sometimes semi-literate practitioners, like surgeons, barbers, folk healers, and so on. Pre-modern phlebotomy was far from confined to the written word alone. It's an important general point to make. And I think we have to be creative in where we find our solutions and information on the practice. For instance, in studies of instrumentation, or maybe even turning to bodies themselves in one way or another in historical and archaeological contexts. But that said, nonetheless, historians of medicine, I'm thinking here of people like Pedro Gil Sotres and others, have shown that European phlebotomical writings in manuscripts tell a story that essentially unfolds in 3 stages. This is a generalization, but it's a very useful one, I think, for getting a quick handle on the material. First, an early practice in the beginning of the medieval period, wherein short texts emerged on the subject that drew principally on classical bloodletting precedents of the ancient Greek corpus, further developed by medieval practitioners in major medical centers of early medieval Europe, places like Salerno, for instance, in Italy. Second, or kind of following on from this, building on this, followed a more, what we might call, robustly theoretical phase of bloodletting, wherein an influx of Arabic sources helped shift the tenor of phlebotomical practice into what we might think of as a more refined mode, perhaps, certainly a more cerebral mode in some ways, in which it was more seamlessly incorporated into medical works with an increasingly connected, increasingly theoretical, increasingly encyclopedic ambition to them. And then thirdly, perhaps finally, by the late 13th century into the 14th century, into the 15th century, so the end of the period in Europe onwards, multiple traditions were starting to intertwine and overlap within the space. Most prominently, in fact, 2 lines of practice were being promoted in manuscript form. Again, this is a kind of simplification, but a useful one. On the one hand, we have, for instance, scholastic medics based in Europe's emerging universities, developing bloodletting's theoretical and therapeutic status, sometimes even through specific monographs or kind of monographic works on the subject of bloodletting. And on the other, sometimes complementing, sometimes contrasting, again, sometimes interlaced with that first approach, is a really rich vernacular practical scene for bloodletting, emerging in a variety of European languages as well as in Latin. And this is an often fragmented series of much more practically oriented texts that were regularly being recombined and reworked without necessarily any clear or specific authorship or ground recourse to theoretical traditions of humoral balance and bloodletting, but which were nonetheless packed with lots of technical information on the craft. So, in short, just to summarize this, together these twin avenues by the end of the Middle Ages in Europe really made clear that many types of medic, many different types of medic, could rely on a rich and varied body of manuscripts. And they could rely on that thought to clarify bloodletting's theoretical, but also practical variables. And they could, in short, communicated a really broad range of information. They would tell you things like the type of patient who was appropriate to have bloodlet, so avoiding the vulnerable old and the young. They would tell you what the skills of what made a good bloodletter: steady hand, keen eyesight. They would tell you, for instance, information on the timing of procedures in relation to the astrological movement of the planets, the seasons of the year, the time of day. And they would also pepper their texts with all sorts of other practical details, the identification of veins that needed to be bled in certain ways for certain different kinds of conditions, the depth and direction of cuts, the inspection of drawn blood, and also lots on the aftercare of patients, rest, certain diets. My favorite thing is often the regular encouragement of a kind of positive mental outlook to aid recovery from any treatments undergone. So in short, an incredibly rich set of texts with a lot to say: bloodletting context, image context. Now, it's interestingly around the end of the 14th century, so coincident with that third phase that I was talking about, a sort of explosion of both phlebotomical theory and practice in Latin and the vernacular, that images began to play a more central role. Precisely what first moved the makers of these books to include images in their bloodletting works is absolutely not clear. I don't think it's the kind of question to which we will ever get a clear and succinct answer. although there are things that have been suggested in various helpful ways. Why did they present information pictorially or diagrammatically rather than purely in textual form, as had previously been the case? Maybe, as someone like Helen Vowles has suggested, these images helped navigate increasingly large books. Oh, where's my stuff on bloodletting? Oh yeah, it's where that strange naked man is standing. Maybe the increasing availability of paper allowed for a kind of freedom of space and an incorporation of larger scale images into works. Some have argued, to my mind, not really particularly convincingly, given there's no actual tangible practical evidence for it, that these figures are based on classical precedents, now lost because the medicine that they convey in itself had classical precedent. But as I say, there's nothing particularly concrete to tie us down to that. For my money, for what it's worth, I think probably that these are images that are responding to contemporary late 14th and 15th century developments, in particular an increasing use of figural diagrams more generally in medieval intellectual culture to show things, for instance, like on the left-hand side, Christian good deeds in the center, positive monastic ways of living or negative monastic ways of living, and on the right, the so-called tree of consanguinity, the limits of intermarriage as allowed in various legal texts. So a lot of figural diagrams emerging across intellectual culture, and especially it's worth saying in medicine as well, showing on the left issues of astrology and the signs of the zodiac, in the middle, the skeleton as part of one of several bodily systems, and on the right, wounds and potential surgical interventions to them. So these are all things that could increasingly be plotted via figures, and that word figures can be used in all sorts of different interesting ways. But regardless of origins, which as I say, I don't think we'll ever tie down, and I wouldn't even particularly want to, I say one of the real buzzwords here is breadth. They're very chronologically broad, as I said. This is one of the earliest known, maybe even the earliest known. They're very hard to date these things with any real certainty. They're found in a medical compilation likely gathered together at the Parisian Abbey of Saint-Victoire. This is a manuscript now in the BNF. And its bloodletting material dates at least back to the late 13th, maybe early 14th centuries. And just to give you a sense of how this image is working, on the right-hand side, what we have is we kind of have across this opening a pairing of phlebotomical image and phlebotomical text. So on the right, we have these short lists of Latin sentences, which tell us the names of veins and the cases in which they should be let. And on the left, we've got this strange figure, this rough, unevenly modeled with this bulbous bowed forehead, with sprouting these lovely wiggling streams of blood from a series of punctures, which on the whole plot in kind of close relation to the names of the veins on the right-hand side. And indeed, from this early example, we have pretty much a bloodletting figure for every decade, or certainly every quarter century, but almost every decade thereafter, throughout the 14th and definitely for the 15th century. They are a constant in certain kinds of medical books, and they're certainly more replicated, I would say, than any other kind of image in medieval medical texts. As well as chronologically broad, it's worth quickly saying, as not a historian, that they are artistically very broad too. We have some incredibly fine, high quality examples, we could say. Clearly the work of highly trained artisans. Look at how the figure on the left in a manuscript now in Wolfenbottel has sort of evacuated this amazingly transparent stomach to show different organs that lie beneath the skin. The way that the figure now in a manuscript in Heidelberg in the bottom right, the artist has used lead white to kind of emphasize individuated ribs, the stretching of the skin. All the way in the figure in the top right, it's a manuscript now in Kassel, but was probably originally made in the southern German city of Passau, creates this bloodletting figure with this kind of beautiful beatific upward-looking expression, these beautiful tangles of hair. And it ranges all the way down from quite nice things like this to less good images, it's fair to say, things which are somewhat scrappier, copied in clearly more impersonal contexts, more on that in a minute. So a real breadth of materials here, in terms of chronology, materiality, lots that we can pull out from this material in all sorts of directions. Then do these figures tell us about scientific translation as a kind of broad case study? And here I want to help us put the term translation itself, as colleagues already have been today, under some critical pressure. because I think they have a lot to say on the subject, moving both from more obvious uses of the term to some that are far less obvious. So in a sense, let's begin with the obvious. That is what we might think about as linguistic translation. Because of course, these images and the materials that they cohabited with in textual materials were themselves much translated things. Roughly half of the 200 or so, as I said, that are currently known that I've managed to look at, feature in manuscripts written in Latin. This one here now in Rome, but originally a German one, probably from the beginning of the 15th century, gives, I think, a pretty good sense of how a lot of these Latin bloodletting figures work. We have this central body. It's inevitably a male body, but we can come back to that idea later if we want to. And branching out from it are a series of kind of linking lines and often a series of bubbles, or at least floating gobbets of text in one way or another, which have short, very statemental nuggets of information on phlebotomy and phlebotomical practice, in particular, the naming of the vein that is being displayed and what it's good to let it for. So I pulled out one of one of the leading or one of the first bubbles often that the eye falls to in these images. Vena in medio frontis, okay, vein in the middle of the forehead, appears against headache and against migraine and against phrenitis, which are steams on the brain, and to reform the damaged brain and against leprosy. Brevity here is the key. It lends clarity and it informs the reader of simple terminology and connects and visualizes information against plotted body. So that's one half of those 200. The other half are translated into a wide range of vernaculars, which often preserve the same statemental style, and in some cases, even the direct medical contents of the Latin examples. We find them in many different languages. In German, so on the left-hand side, vena in media frontis is replaced with the similar kind of refrain, die Ader bei dem Augen, so the vein by the eyes, and ist before, and it would tell you what it was particularly good for letting. In English, on the right-hand side, similar thing, the vein of the heart is called cardiam, so it gives you the name of the vein, and again, what it's good to let. In French, interestingly, there are not many French examples, but the ones that survive, they actually slightly reverse that formula. They tell you they work from a problem back to the vein rather than the other way around. So contre douleur du chef, okay, so against illness of the head and so on. But when we think about Hebrew manuscripts in the same mold being made in Europe, this is an Italian, probably Northern Italian, Southern French example. Vride basilica says at the top, so the basilic vein again, so giving you a sense of the name of the vein and the information about what it's good to let it for, which follows from it. We don't just have German and English and French and Hebrew, there's also Italian. There are a lot of Czech versions, one Irish version, one Welsh version. And I think it's important to stress that we mustn't give the sense that these are isolated traditions. These are not isolated linguistic traditions. Take, for example, this is an absolutely amazing manuscript, which is now in the National Library in Prague. It has loads of prints pasted in it. It's probably made around 1500, but there are two bloodletting figures in it, a few pages apart. One, the one on the left in Latin, the other, the one on the right, in Old Czech. So these can cohabit, made by the same people in the same moment. And indeed, the same individual figure might preserve translation sort of within themselves. I'm giving you here another great example of a manuscript, 15th century manuscript now in Wrocław. And I've just pulled out some of the gobbets on the left-hand side for you as a detail on the right. We can see, vena submento, contra dolorum mamillarum. Okay, so against a kind of disease or kind of illness of the breasts. But if we continue halfway down, I'm reading the bottom paragraph here. If we continue halfway down, we switch from Latin to German. Die Ade unter dem Beine, so that ist gut für, so it's basically the vein in the legs is good for such and such. Tells you a little bit. So, these are directly a kind of hybrid translation and work, I could say. And indeed, if we look closely enough, if we're inventive and creative with how we look at these things, we might even begin to start to put more than one figure together between manuscripts to trace whole networks of translation at work. Consider, for example, these three manuscripts, or these three bloodletting figures from three different manuscripts, all made around the same time in the British Isles, which were made probably going from left to right in London, somewhere west of London, and then on the right in Wales, because they are in Latin, and then lastly in Welsh. So we can really see they have the same curly head figure, exactly the same instructions and exactly the same circles, just linguistically translated from one culture to another. So we could even begin to start to plot these things on routes, should we say. So in short, a locus for some really different linguistic engagements with translating bloodletting practice. But I think we can extend this idea, and maybe this can be kind of maybe one of the more useful contributions of this visual material. We can extend this idea of translation in a few different areas beyond the linguistic. Two that I want to share with you in particular before my time is up. The first, what we might call translations of context. Now, let's think for a minute about the people using these. They're not just abstract images that float through time and space and are now conveniently kept in libraries. They were used. On the one hand, you know, they appear to be part of particularly intimate personal objects. I sort of suggested this when I showed you these two crappy figures. Now, we don't have a lot of information on ownership, but from what we do, we can start to piece together various scraps of evidence to suggest, or at least intimate, that many were owned by practicing surgeons and physicians, surgeons in particular. Tiziano Possenti, for example, has identified one 15th century manuscript, an Italian manuscript, owned by a man named Francesco Zurla da Brescia, an Italian barber surgeon, who prized the book so highly that he bequeathed it to his son Giovanni to use. So these are familial works, and indeed that book had a bloodletting figure inside it. These kind of the scrappy nature, as I was suggesting, of some images implied that probably similarly they were copied by individuals simply into their notebooks, and making these kind of personal medical visual archives, which had all sorts of interesting potential functions. Maybe as an aide-memoire for an experienced surgeon, but probably more likely something that might have been used in the process of learning surgery, or indeed maybe in some kind of patient-doctor interaction. Oh, there's something wrong with you. Let me go to my incredibly fancy book, which has got a nice illustration in it, because I've been really well paid. Because, by the way, I've killed loads of people and I haven't killed anyone. Yeah, is that kind of attitude we're talking about? So, you know, it's very interesting to think about how these books are used. So lots of surgeons and physicians using them, but we also have evidence of other maybe less expected individual users translating, we're using that word increasingly flexibly now, translating medical ideas into their own, sometimes quite distinct worlds. Lucy Dolezalova on the left, or rather has identified that the author of the book on the left is a cleric, a Czech cleric, a man named Krutz of Telec, active in the city of Trebon in Bohemia, who followed his medical counterparts, surgeons he would have been sharing the world with, in sketching out his own bloodletting figure, but here not so much alongside a book of medical texts, but a book of largely religious texts, so not exclusively medical material. Likewise, we have a couple of examples, as on the right-hand side, of bloodletting figures and bloodletting information contained in what's become known in the German tradition as Hausbücher. So the Hausbücher tradition, house books. These are highly illustrated, proto how-to style books, which included medical and paramedical knowledge, produced in Europe for largely elite upper classes. So these are lay individuals who might never really have had much need to put their phlebotomical knowledge into practice, but nonetheless wanted possession of it, and so had it translated into tomes for their personal libraries. Another example still indicate perhaps even more drastic, even more public forms of translation for these bloodletting figures out of codexic books altogether. Take this example, now sadly sliced in half, you'll see why in a minute, from the German town of Beilngries in Bavaria. Now this, the reason it's sliced in half is because it was found repurposed as binding material for one of the town's later court registers from the year 1537. But the clever digging of historian Max Kunzel has shown that other sources from the town in the year 1537, one of the town's account books, shows that it was exactly in that year that the town's Lasttafel, that is its bloodletting table, was replaced with a printed example, it says, that was used in a similar way to the manuscript example. And from this source, we learn that this manuscript example, which is quite large, was pinned up in the town hall for members of the municipal council to consult. So it was in a semi-public space, and it helped these senior officials gauge what aspects of medical treatments might or might not be necessary for a particular sickly individual in the town, and whether or not they needed to send for help from the nearby sister city of Eichstätt, which was some 8 hours away, where the most local medical practitioner was based. This might be something similar to this, going on to this massive manuscript page, which has now been folded into a larger book now in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. The gloves are there of their insistence, I should say, not my training. But it's a really massive, like 80 centimeters, it's about this big. You can see it, my hand right next to it, and it's still got pin marks at the top, which suggests maybe some kind of public viewing. And indeed, I was going through this book of Bartholomew the Englishman's, a French translation of Bartholomew the Englishman's De Proprietatibus Rerum, and maybe these are contested images within the history of art and the history of medicine, but maybe that's what's going on here. We've got a learned, kind of academic showing a layman at the beginning of a section on the anatomy of the body. He's kind of pointing towards this figure, which looks suspiciously like his bloodletting figures with this little mounded hill. So in short, yes, the owners and users of these books represented really a familiar medieval monoculture. They're all educated enough to read, most of them are. They're all men, looking at images of men, but their contexts were not the same. They were different users translating the same bloodletting materials and the same images into contexts, from the personal to the communal. Okay, I've got just a couple of minutes left. So one final area in which I think we might think of translation as happening in these images. Again, not linguistically, not contextually, but visually, visual translations. That's to say that as well as they're changing written language and context, these images, I think, also preserve what we might want to call changes in strategy towards conveying their bloodletting knowledge. These are translations between different diagrammatic approaches. Now, I've already shared with you what we might think of as the standard route that these images most often take, a central body around which we have a cluster of bubbles or gobbets of practical text. But some examples show how quite quickly this becomes quite complicated. This is another very large example, about 80 centimeters again, by about 40 or 50 centimeters now in Copenhagen, in which the maker has wanted to include slightly more bloodletting information than is typical. And as you can see from the absolute mass of rather chaotic red lines which bounce backwards and forwards across different points of the body, to the extent that the maker themselves have got quite confused and had to erase them and then put in new red lines, it gets pretty tricky pretty quickly. It's chaotic in this sense. It's not impossible, but pretty difficult to decipher. And looking across the corpus with this idea in mind, we see that I think this prompts a response from certain kinds of users and makers to translate the same information into new, far more functional, arguably more useful visual forms. Some take this quite simply by enacting the simple step of dividing up the text. Shout out to Sims manuscript LJS 449 on display, now showing just next door if you want to go and take a little look at it, where the maker of this German manuscript has decided to divide one figure up into 4, leaving much more space for the kind of textual visual interplay. Although I would suggest, as the zoom on the right shows, the close-up on the right shows, it's not always successful. It's quite hard to read. Others, and this interestingly seems to be an innovation specifically of German makers in the early 15th century, took this one step further and created a series of innovative system of keys to connect image and information. So these could be keys of numbers, whereby individual parts of the body led, or these linking lines led not to text, but to numbers, or to letters. And down the left is one of my favorites, actually. And on either the preceding pages or the pages that followed this figure, we would have paragraphs that could shift and change in size with the corresponding letter or the corresponding. So text and image working in a different kind of consort. They would still need both elements of this hybrid unit, but just connected in slightly different diagrammatic ways. So these changes, I think, make clear that users and makers were invested in translating not only bloodletting context, but also their methods of bloodletting communication. And indeed, I think we don't, in a sense, this is too long a story to get into now, but this flexibility, for me at least, seems to kind of give unmoored sense of image and information, which opened up these bloodletting figures to even more radical translations in the period after the material I'm showing, or at least towards the end of it. As I said, it's too long a story now, but I think it's something that we have to think about in relation to the history of technology and translations of technology, because these images quickly and internationally appeared in print in Augsburg in 1484, Venice in 1491, Paris in 1493, preserving different elements of these kind of diagrammatic qualities that I've been sharing with you. And this is something that in turn, we dial the clock even further forwards, led to even more wild translations across oceans and across cultures. Just to give one example, this is an early 17th century Spanish treatise and a figure which kind of contains some aspects of bloodletting as well as zodiac imagery, which appears to have been the, I don't know if inspiration is the right word, but certainly the model in some ways for an image here on the right-hand side of the so-called Codex Mexicanus. This is one of those Mexican almanacs or books of fate, which included both indigenous Nahuatl calendrical and astrological information alongside, or maybe atop, colonial Western material as well. So, in a sense, there we have it. This is a body of images that give us, I think, a case study to start to think about translation in all sorts of interesting ways. Not just where and how information was translated, but also what we actually mean by scientific translation itself. Are we talking about language? Are we talking about context? Are we talking about technology? Or are we talking about all? Thanks very much.
Thank you to both of our speakers for these really wonderful presentations. To open it up to the audience for questions, both in person and those of you virtually. Yes, please.
Question for Dominic. First of all, I found those ect print, ect types, something moving about them. There's something emotionally moving. So I don't know why. But that's not the point. Has there been any technical analysis of the pigments that were used? So what do you think it is? Because it you don't see it going through the page, because if you press through paper, then you would see, if it was an aqueous thing with water, it would probably bleed on the other side, and there's not much of it. I wonder if it's some oily stuff.
Well, it's linseed oil. We have some descriptions of the beginning of the 16th century.
Yeah.
Saying that you use linseed oil and soot, but the pigments, because there is also a green color in some of them, what I've shown today. I don't know what green color that would be. Maybe it's the soot that changed the color with the years, but I don't think so. It looks really green.
I suspect just like that, it would be a mineral pigment, not a vegetal pigment. Some sort of earth created to create a green, yeah.
There is no analysis on this.
Okay, no, it's fascinating stuff. Thank you.
It's for Jack. I was wondering if you say a little bit more about other images that accompany the bloodletting figure in some of the manuscripts, right? Because often this isn't just a bloodletting text with bloodletting images, but that they're sometimes in other, either in compilations or what have you, but they're often with, or at least sometimes with, other kinds of diagrams, like the Zodiac Man or the one with all the weapons attached to him, or even a urine wheel or something like that. So can you just say a little bit more about, like, is that, am I just thinking of a few isolated examples, or is that something that's more prevalent in this huge corpus that you're looking at?
I think you are thinking of some more isolated examples in that if you get, firstly, it's not very common to get images in medical manuscripts, so I don't want to get skewed to interest. And some which are invested in showing multiple images will always include almost always include a bloodletting figure alongside other things. So in those contexts, it accompanies other examples. But I would say of the ones I've looked at, not the, at least 3/4 are the only image in the book. Am I exaggerating there? I don't think so. I think that's about right. Lots of them are the only image in the book, which is unusual. As in, it suggests a certain uniqueness. It suggests, I also think, a certain, why is it that phlebotomy, we get, I guess when we have texts on medicinal cupping, for instance, you might get other images which plot. But I guess a lot of the texts which it accompanies are texts which aren't really so explicitly about this kind of and if they are, they're often about operations which it just wouldn't be appropriate or easy to showcase in a single image, capture that kind of quality. And that's something that doesn't really happen until the middle of the 15th century anyway. So yeah, he's often quite isolated, actually. Yeah.
We've got Nick, and I also saw we have questions from our virtual audience.
Thank you both. This is a question for Dominic also. When first, just to note that we have in our herbal that's on display, which is 15th century herbal, there's actually an X-type right at the back, just a one-off. So we should all take a look at it after we finish. But I was wondering if you had, if there's any evidence of, the time of year at which these prints are being made, and whether, like, what this, the status of growth of each specimen is, and whether you could ascertain whether this was all done in one season, in one day, or whether this is somebody who's waiting through a whole season to capture each specimen at a specific point.
Very interesting question. With the nature prints I have shown, it's very difficult to arrive to conclusions. Something can be done, but with others I didn't show because it would have been too much. I guess they are dried plants because in some of the leaves you can see breaks, and there are also some of the printer illustrations, they use the same plant to make several prints. So you can make multiple prints with one plant, which is also very interesting. Exactly. So you can see how it degrades. So from this, I can say it's a dried plant. And on the prints I have shown, in some of them there are also breaks. So I would suppose it's the same thing. But the description of 1784, on the other hand, says better use fresh plants. So I would suppose, anyway, I would suppose they have been collected as dried plants and then used at some point. Maybe even made multiple prints. If this was really a workshop, then it's something incredible. At that time, you sell it in the proximity of the universities, the big medical universities at Padua. You sell something for students or maybe for professors. Maybe they tried really to make these multiple prints. I don't have evidence from the ones I have seen, but for later times, but it's possible.
Virtual question, and then we'll come back to the room.
All right, so we have a question for Jack. What are the range of textual topics that manuscripts with bloodletting figures cover, and are these consistent across locations and languages of production?
Very, very broad still. So you'll find them, you get so for instance, texts which are or images which seem to have just been copied down by an individual who maybe is recording it in their own personal medical notebook, might be very wide range, including kind of more technical information, major authors, translated material, their own translations of material, small texts on particular diseases and how to cure them. So very, very wide ranging, I would say. There's, we're talking about 200 medical books, of which are, it's a corpus which often are a rare, well, the one exception I would say actually is that sometimes we find these, quite regularly, we find these figures. I need to look more closely at the codicology of these things, but we find them kind of tipped into larger manuscripts, often at the very beginning or the very end, sometimes even pasted onto the binding. Onto the board of the binding, of the cover. And in that case, you might have quite a coherent medical book, which is one large Latin translation of a particular medical text used in university teaching from beginning to end, the Abbott's Canon or something like that. But then you have this figure accompanying it. But otherwise, I would say, they're about as coherent as the medical corpus itself, which is very good.
I have questions for both of you, but I'll limit myself to then a question for Dominic since we're going back and forth. I wanted to ask about, you said, I think you argued very very neatly the way this is sort of a new medium that allows for reproduction of key aspects of the plants that allow for a new maybe way of transmitting knowledge about these plants. And I was wondering, sort of then comparing it to something like Dioscorides or any of these pictorial copying that may be subject to sort of transmission errors, but also don't require a specimen, as Nick is, the actual specimen to reproduce, to sort of further reproduce. Does that lead to a different dynamics of the tradition that is, of less of a sort of an established corpus of plants, and it being much more local to wherever presumably, but and maybe not in terms of dried plants. So I'm just wondering, does it change the dynamics in any sort of appreciable way?
Interesting question. Well, one of the changes is, I guess, the mobility. Like you can take it to Germany from Italy, and they are not destroyed. This is, I guess, a big change, and the fact that you can, I guess, quite easily for a professional who knows how to do it, they can produce it quite quickly and quite massively, like these multiple prints. So this is for sure a change. Then yes, sure, there are local plants that are not described in Dioscorides. I mean, you have plants here from the banks of northern Italy. This is not described in described in Dioscorides. So I have completely new plants, and that's why I think it's linked to some local studies. So the university rather. And I know there was a big concurrence between Pavia as a medical faculty at the end of the 14th century and Padua. Pavia had a very big faculty at the time, which was later then not existed anymore. So Padua had the reign of medical faculty. But at that time, they made a big concurrence. So I would say they tried to produce their own specificity in medical or plant production. So it's really striking that so many of these pictures come from the Belluno area, which is north of Padua, also not far away from Pavia, but there must have been a center, and this is very interesting. There is some kind, even if it's not really organized with organized structures, but there must have been a nucleus, like when many people come together, maybe from the university, where these pictures have been produced. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for these papers. They were both wonderful. I have a question for Jack, and it's about, have you tried to see whether these bloodletting images can that there is any other kind of genealogy that you can find coming from other cultures? Because it just, the image of the 5 figures that it popped up in one of your pictures, there is all this tradition coming from the Arabic tradition, and bloodletting was something that was shared by the whole humoral medical system. So I wonder whether there is any connection. that we
Yeah,
make.
it's really interesting. I haven't looked for bloodletting figures in that context, in part because the 5 figures that Montserrat's talking about is one of a system of 9 different images, which some of the earliest medical illustrative images of different systems of the body, the veins, arteries, bones, nerves, and muscles. And then other kind of detail of the reproductive organs, brain, other parts of the other organs as well. You know, it was long argued that these European images that first, the earliest, I believe, comes from the 12th century, the beginning of the 12th century, that because they sort of started to appear in Europe around the same time as Arabic medicine was starting to make its way into Latinate writing, that those images too must have come from Arabic sources. But the earliest Arabic examples we have, there's some great ones here in the collection, we'll plug for Sims again, really they are later than the European ones we have. And they seem to flourish in the 14th and 15th centuries. And so in a sense, it could be an interesting point of, it's been posited and people I don't think have, you know, these are often quite siloed groups of kind of scholarly rabbit holes, but you need people with the kind of amazing linguistic skills that have already been on show today to be able to kind of match this up. I don't have that. And I don't think that many people who do have focused on it, because it could be a really interesting example actually of a West-East kind of visual tradition. So actually it might be referring to medicine that had come east-west, or rather gone west and come east and gone west and then bounced backwards and forwards in these different cultures, but actually is moving eastwards. And so because that's a complicated issue, I've not really tackled that material, to be honest with you, yet, but I'm sure there are in the Arabic speaking world bloodletting figures. The question is, when are they being made? And my sense is, at least, that they're not being made before the early ones in the West. But I'm happy to be proven wrong on that. So it's a tricky issue, and one that, you know,
Yeah.
someone who has excellent Arabic and can do that work would be, or indeed anyone Arabic speaking wants to do a little collaboration. I mean, that would be a really interesting project. Thank you.
Is it all right? Handing the microphone down the row.
Yeah, I was doing some heavy lifting.
So my question is to both of you, but it's 2 different questions. Thank you for these great talks. The phlebotomy, is there any connection with practices of autopsy or anatomies of any kind? And with the plant images, is there any connection with botanical gardens or any kind of gardening?
On the autopsy,
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to go?
No.
You think, and I'll pedal.
I can help you.
It's not something I've thought about, but my initial instinct is to say no, in part because, you know, they are interestingly kind of chronologically concurrent, actually, kind of the rise in the 14th century and 15th century of anatomical practice. Yes, what is interesting though is that is in text often closely associated with Italian authors, people like Mondino da Luzzi, and actually there are very, very, very few bloodletting figures that seem to have been made in Italian books. So it's a kind of interesting black hole, so to speak. Loads in Germany, quite a few in France, a lot in England. So there's a geographical clash, although it's not inconceivable that books obviously are moving around. But also, you know, this is really about preserving life, and it's to help people with living ailments. And so I guess if anatomy does come into it, you do need to have some anatomical knowledge that someone is ailing in their, you know, I don't know, in their gallbladder or in their liver, in order to then know to treat it, to get to the right bit of the, and so they're related in terms of they plot technical and terminological and taxonomic understandings of the body back to texts. But I don't think they're directly related other than that. But it would be interesting to kind of play that out a bit more.
Yeah, may I also ask, So what kind of physicians were doing phlebotomy? Are these wound physicians?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, so again, we don't have that many images, books and images within them that are keyed to direct individuals. Those that we do know seem to be largely surgeons. But, you know, physicians, there are many kinds of kind of people who have the knowledge which might class one as a physician. You don't have to be a court physician or a university physician, where you might be talking about prescribing bloodletting, but not carrying it out yourself. In fact, maybe this is all you need to know. I mean, maybe that is a stand-in for the kind of physicality of actually doing the practice for a learned professor who wouldn't have actually gone and done it themselves. But likewise, we know we have people who take that knowledge, you know, so there's one example of a surgeon named Jean Gisbardin, who seems to have worked in and around Grenoble and moved around a lot, and his notebook has texts copied out in a way that we might expect of a university. He's a 15th century guy, of a university student. So he has some good knowledge of material, but he's also got cases there which suggest that he's traveling over large areas and is actually working much more like a surgeon. He sketches his own tools in the back of it as well. It's kind of interesting. So tricky to say. I don't want to say that, even there are so many of them, I don't want to say hard and fast who's using these things.
Yeah, I have another.
Your turn. We'll have a chat.
My turn first. Yeah, so, no, university gardens or botanical gardens appear in the 16th century, as you know. So we have really very little information about where these plants were kept. It's a very, I mean, we know that pharmacists have had dried plants as medicine, because that was the medicine at that time, of course. So they sold it. They probably had stocks. We know about these wooden boxes where they were stocked in. But where they came from, no, we don't know.
So they're related to apothecaries? The apothecaries had.
Yeah. Apothecaries had it.
Surely they're kept in these books. These books are the garden.
These books are the gardens, yes.
Intersection of our two talks to end this panel on. Please join me in thanking our speakers. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all tomorrow. Pass it to Lynn to say a few words.
Yeah, I don't have much to say, but I thank you to all the speakers today. You've given us a lot of information, new ideas we can take home and digest and sleep on, and then come back tomorrow refreshed to start again. Nick, I mean, I think, is there anything I need to mention? I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh, well. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe for another half hour or so. Okay. All right, we start back tomorrow at 9:30 again.